My name is David Klinger, and I'm 78, and I was born in Rogers, Arkansas in 1944 during the World War II. My mom and dad, my dad was Sherman T. Klinger. My mom was Mildred Pearlie Marlin. Neither of them were born in Rogers. They came different paths to Rogers. My mom came, her parents brought her up from Independence County when she was 3 years old. My grandfather, I might add, my grandfather, Fred Marlin, we've got pictures of him with a buckboard and mules right out here on the Bentonville Square. He carried freight over the Ozark Mountains, and in so doing he became familiar with Rogers and Harrison and Bentonville, and he eventually decided he would move from they lived in Jamestown, a small town across the river from Batesville, and it burned. And so they decided they would leave and come to northwest Arkansas. And my grandma used to tell me that my grandpa picked Rogers over Harrison because Harrison had too many shootings. And so that they wound up in Rogers when my mom was 3. And I might add something about my grandparents. My grandmother, my maternal grandmother's name was Tennessee Elizabeth York. And of course she had relatives that came from Tennessee. And as a matter of fact, I found out after her death that she was kin to Alvin York, the World War I hero. She never told me that. And but I found out through various means, including after I was a judge. A man showed up at my office one day when I was in Carroll County and told my secretary that he was doing a genealogy on Alvin York, and my name came up. And so I guess it's true. In any event, my grandma was originally from Stone County before she married Grandpa. Her dad was a sheriff. I didn't realize that. I knew that he had men in custody. I thought he was a constable. She said at times he would chain men to the floor at night when it was too late to take them to the county seat. So and he later became a state legislator. I didn't know that until later. In the event, they came to Rogers in 1918. And my grandfather, who'd been known for his mules and his harness back in Independence County, got into the taxi business and the bus line business. And he opened a huge bus station there on the corner of Poplar and 2nd that was a landmark. And Greyhound bus was there. He had gas, he had garage, and he serviced the cars of Rogers for years. And his taxi drivers, I remember when they got two-way radios. That was a new invention. And so that's my mom's side. My dad's side, his mom and dad, my grandmother and my grandfather were educators. And as a result, they moved around, and as a result, my dad, I think, was born in Mansfield, Ohio or somewhere. His younger brother, Billy, was born in Laurel, Montana, and their youngest brother, Freddie, was born in Dallas, Texas. But anyway, they all wound up in here in Rogers, I think due to health problems of my grandpa, who became the city attorney, or the clerk. And and the first Republican in Rogers. It's caused a lot of lively conversation, I understand. And as a matter of fact, he also established a nursery, orchards, peaches, apples. This used to be the apple capital of the world. It was enormous, and the Klinger Orchards nursery put out thousands of orchards, trees throughout northwest Arkansas, not just in Benton County, but in Carroll County, elsewhere. Eventually, my grandpa died. He died before I was born. And so there was my grandma with 3 growing boys. They grew up, and eventually they all went to war. And as a matter of fact, my mother and father, I think, were married around 1940 or 41, 40, because they had my sister in 1941. He'd been activated. As a matter of fact, he had joined the National Guard at the insistence of a good friend of his in Rogers named J. Wesley Sampier. J. Wesley was quite a fella and had a son named John, who's still alive and well and was the mayor of Rogers for many years. But Sherman joined the Guard, and by the time they were activated in 1941 and began their training, getting ready for the war, he'd become the company commander of the battery, the company there in Rogers, the 142nd Field Artillery. And eventually, at one point in time, my father and his two brothers were all in Europe at the same time fighting the Nazis. And apparently it really was hard on my grandma. So, in any event, after the war, we lived at Rogers. In fact, at that point in time, we lived on a 20-acre little farm, exactly where the Catholic Church sits today. As a matter of fact, my parents sold the land to the Catholic Church when we moved at one point in time. My dad stayed in the National Guard after they came back from the war, and eventually obtained a job, was given a position at Camp Robinson, which is down next to North Little Rock, at deactivated Army post, but it's headquarters of the National Guard. And so he became full-time Guard official from that point on. Now, that meant we lived at Camp Robinson, moved to Camp Robinson, and we were there for, he was called the United States Property and Physical Officer. He was a colonel, and he was the liaison between the federal government and the Guard. A pretty good job, which he lost as soon as they changed governors. Governor Cherry was elected. I think he beat Governor McMath, I'm not sure. And so that meant my dad was out, and we came back to Rogers. And however, he stayed in the Guard, and then after a couple of years, Orville Faubus was elected governor. And he appointed my dad as Adjutant General. And that lasted for the next 12 years, as long as Faubus was in office. Now, that meant that we lived there then at Camp Robinson for several years, and I went to high school at a place out in the country called Sylvan Hills. And things were a little different living at camp, but the time came when the integration issues began to crop up. And as a matter of fact, in September, I think maybe September 4th of 1957, Faubus called the National Guard out to go to Little Rock Central. As a matter of fact, I answered the phone when the governor's office called for my dad. So I guess I'm part of history there. In any event, the next day the Guard was deployed at camp at Central High School, and they, as a matter of fact, blocked the 9 black children that were to integrate Central under the recent U.S. Supreme Court decision. And Eisenhower was the president, and he quickly responded by sending the 101st Airborne to Camp Robinson to get those young children into the school. So he federalized the National Guard, which federalized my dad and federalized all the Guard, and they became then under federal control. And so the 101st Airborne, they They were there approximately 5 or 6 days in absolute control of security around Central High School. And then after about 5 days, the National Guard took over, the federalized National Guard. And instead of keeping the young black children out, they escorted them in. So the role had changed. The 101st was staying. They were bivouacked out in Camp Robinson, not far from where we lived. And they showed movies there for the troops at the old officers' mess hall. And I'd ride my horse down there at night and go in there with the 101st Airborne boys and watch movies. I remember Gunfight at the OK Corral as one of them. And I guess I was impressed with those fellows because right after high school, I went in the Army and went airborne. I wasn't assigned to the 101st, I was assigned to the 82nd. In any event, I went in and enlisted. While I was in the Army, I went to OCS and became an officer, and determined to get out because I didn't have a college degree. And I knew I wasn't going to get ahead in the regular Army, so I was relieved from active duty. I was a reservist, and I came home, kind of at loose ends, but didn't have any money. But I borrowed some money. The GI Bill was not in effect at that time, but I was still in the reserves as an officer, so I borrowed some money from the state of Arkansas Education Department, went up to the Capitol myself and made a loan, and was able to enter college at UCA, public ASTC, I think it was called back then. Now it's University of Central Arkansas. And that's how I began. And when I was in school there, I met my first wife-to-be, and eventually they did introduce renew the GI Bill, and that put that and my reserve pay and my working summers put me and my wife through college. And it continued on into law school. Because after college, I decided I'm going to go to law school. And so I went up to Fayetteville and entered law school, and it was fun, and I had to work. I mean, I was an honor graduate, one of the honor graduates in OCS, and I was one of the honor graduates in high school. But I was working summers in law school, hanging live turkeys at Tyson's because I was supposed to go to work for the post office for the summer, but because of my test results. But because I was in the reserve and had the summer camp, they would not take me. Luckily for me, the law changed, and so the next summer they had to take me. So I got to work in the post office during the summer. In any event, graduated from law school, and I really didn't, sort of a loose end, I just determined to go to Rogers and hang out a shingle. And I did with another fellow that I was in law school with, and we went to Rogers and we borrowed some money from Howard Slinkard. And we borrowed some money from the local First National Bank and financed an office and private practice for about 3 years. And during that period of time, the then prosecuting attorney, who was Gary Kennan, offered me a job. He was getting a new position. He only had one deputy, a deputy named Kevin Pollock, but he was getting some LEA, Law Enforcement Administration funds from the federal government to fund another deputy prosecutor. So he offered me the job, and I jumped at it. I was kind of bored with private practice, and I was looking for some action, and I found it. He hired me effective September the 1st of 1975. And I remember that day well because it was a Monday, it was Labor Day, and I got a paid holiday. my first day on the job. In any event, I became a deputy prosecutor, and I really liked it. I was in all the action. I got all the action I wanted.
So tell me, what was it like in the 70s when you were working in the prosecutor's office?
Well, I was the second deputy prosecutor, so that tells you something about our population. We didn't even have a full-time prosecutor. Gary Kennan had a private practice. All the prosecutors up to that point in time also had private practice. But Gary went full-time, the first full-time prosecutor in the history of Benton County. And he did so because it qualified him for some federal funds, so he didn't lose much. And they also funded the renovation of the downstairs here in the courthouse to establish the prosecuting attorney's office. There was plenty of crime. On my first week on the job, they had a 2-week murder case that started, and it was a rather spectacular murder case involving charges against Alex Montez of Casa Montez restaurant chain, and in essence Don Tyson, although he was not a named defendant in the case, but it was a charge of it was a murder for hire case. And so I had a conflict because I actually knew some information about the case that I had learned from through a lady who had also been charged, and she came and talked to the attorney next door to me, and he brought me in and filled me in, and I said, let's take it, we can win this one. But he didn't, and as a result of his not taking it, 2 attorneys took the case, one for Alex Montez and one of them for the lady. And the attorney for Alex Montez was an attorney named Bill Putman. And Bill Putman was one of my best teachers in law school. He got me through law school. And there he was renowned as a defense attorney. And I got to sit up there for the next week watching Bill Putman in action and realized he is a man on fire. He was deadly in the courtroom. He was just, in my opinion, probably the finest defense attorney that I eventually ever was up against. But after a week of the trial, I went to deputy prosecutor's school in Camden. So I wasn't there for the last week, and it did not go well for the prosecution. And after the second week, I think the jury might have been out 30 minutes and acquitted them, both, the man and the woman, Alex and the lady. And so, but that helped make me my mind up. If I ever became prosecutor, I would be careful and I would be prepared, particularly against people like Bill Putman. But there were other homicide cases during my career as a deputy prosecutor. It was our population was small compared to today. I think Rogers was probably 11,000 when I ran for prosecutor. It's now 67 or something of that nature. And but it was slower. It also, everything was slower paced. The dockets weren't as crowded. We only had one circuit judge, Judge Enfield, and we had one chancery judge, and that was Judge Coxey, who'd been prosecuting attorney up here for 22 years. And that's all we had. Now we've got 7 or 8 circuit judges, I don't know how many, and that's how things have changed. I think there's probably from 2 or 3 people in the prosecutor's office, an army of 40 or so. It's really grown with the population and with the crime that comes with bigger populations.
You've handled a lot of cases over the years as prosecutor. What are some of the ones that stand out?
Well, I did have, of course, I was there for 16 years, and as a result, I was going to have a lot of big cases. But I had some serious murder cases to begin with. Jim Shaw. He had killed 2 people, shot Alvia and Beatrice. I think their last name was Arnold, and dumped them into a cistern, and they weren't discovered for 3 weeks in the dead of summer. Eventually, he was apprehended. The murder was before I became prosecutor. They caught him after I was prosecutor, so I prosecuted him. There was a fellow by the name of Floyd Jr. Cotton killed his brother-in-law, Fred Taylor. But the big one, the first really big one I had, it sort of was a shocker to the community. It happened on, I think, January the 8th, 1981. And we had a gentleman named Don Lehman. He and his brother, Tuffy Lehman, were big-time builders in Rogers. And they built big, fine homes, and well-liked and well-respected in the community. Don had a wife and 2 daughters, and lived in a fine, new, but small subdivision there in Rogers. And one night, there was a knock on the door, and Don went to the door and made the mistake of opening it because, by coincidence, he said, "Who's there?" And the man said, "David." Well, the man that was there was not David. His name was Darrell Ridgely, but he used an alias of David. And it just so happened that Don's other daughter was out with a boy named David that night. And so Don opened the door, and he saw 4 masked men standing there. So he immediately tried to close the door, and he called his other daughter in, Vicky, in to help. And the 2 of them tried to keep the door closed, but they couldn't fight 4 men. And the 4 men burst in, and they worked Don over pretty good, but he got away from them and was headed for the bedroom, we think probably to get one of his guns, and they shot him. And then they got him down on the wife, and in front of his wife and daughter, shot him again. And that then they robbed the place and fled. And I will say this: they did not, other than the shock and fear that was put into the ladies, they didn't harm them. That rattled this community, and that was my first big case as prosecutor. And they were all rounded up, due mainly to some excellent police work. I learned during my years as prosecutor that we had some of the best investigating officers in various agencies around here, anywhere. And they did some great work, and within within 24 hours or so, they had 4 of them rounded up. And that led to a pretty sensational trial. We kept them together. And Zolly was a deputy prosecutor. She'd just become a deputy prosecutor. She actually wasn't on the job when that murder took place. But she got in on that case too, as well as Ray Bunch, who was a deputy prosecutor. And so we started preparing for trial, and it wound up, we had a good judge, a really good circuit judge named William Enfield, and he didn't let things lie around. He pushed that case, and so we finally got to trial in the fall of '81. And it was quite a trial with 4 defendants, and each of them had at least 2 attorneys, so there were 12 of them and 3 of us. And I think that trial lasted for about at least a month, maybe a little bit more. And when the dust settled, that jury convicted all 4 of them and sentenced all 4 of them to die. So, and a personal thing that was happening during that trial, I began to lose weight. And I never have been a weight loser. I was always a weight gainer. And it was unusual for me, even though it was a high stress trial. And I ran every day that I could. Tried to stay in shape, but losing weight was new. And I kept complaining to Zolly and Ray that this isn't me, there's something wrong. And eventually, after the conviction and 4 men sentenced to die, I went to the doctor and told him I think something's wrong, and they couldn't find anything. And like they said, I was healthy as a horse, but I knew something was wrong, and so I continued to lose weight, and I went back to the doctor, James Arkins, and he eventually sent me to some specialists in Fayetteville, and they put me through the ringer. They couldn't find anything wrong, sent me home, and I was persistent. I kept going back to Arkins, and then one night, Arkins, who became suspicious of my high blood pressure, and I was otherwise in pretty good shape, he became suspicious and ran tests, and eventually became concerned that I might have kidney cancer. And so eventually they put me through some more tests and concluded, as a matter of fact, my right kidney was cancerous. Kidney cancer back in those days was generally fatal. I think the survival rate at that time was about 6%. It was deadly. And so they had to take it out, and I just didn't want the notoriety of the world knowing I was deathly sick and gone from the office. And so I called Zolly and Ray in and said, I'm going out of town, I'll be gone a while, and I'm turning it over to you, and I don't want anybody to know it. And I left it with them. And they ran the office for 30 days, and they kept their mouths shut. And it was a rough go. The surgery is rough, recuperation is rough. And I worked hard at trying to come back early. So I exercised and did everything I could do to get in shape to come back. But still, I looked bad. And matter of fact, after I was back at work, here in this courthouse, I ran into David Matthews, a very well-known and very prominent and effective attorney. I met him down in the lobby, and he said, "What happened to you?" He said, "You look like you almost died." And I just said, "Well, I was sick." And I kept it to myself, and eventually I was back in gear and on to other big cases. Another big case we had was after Don Layman. One that was interesting because it went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court was Vicky Rock. Vicky Rock had shot and killed her husband, who was younger than her. Shot him with a .22 at their home when he was leaving to go out on the town, and she didn't want that to happen. She was it was sort of a sad case. She was a good woman. She'd been in the military, and she was, I'm afraid, she was overweight and plain, and she got Frank as a young man and sort of made him a man. And then he began to think about wandering, and that broke her heart, and she shot and killed him. And I charged her, because of the emotions involved, I charged her with manslaughter. That's when I think I met Bill Putman for the first time, toe to toe. Now, I will say this about Putman. In those days, when the county people got sued, like our sheriff or the deputies, civil rights, we had the luxury back then of being able to name our attorney. Our insurance company let us name our attorney. Well, I always named Bill Putman. And so I had been in federal court several times with Putman during this period of time as he defended our sheriff or our sheriff deputies. And again, I have to say, I was so impressed with his ability in the courtroom in those federal civil rights cases. I would sit there, watch him. You know, we were up against some pretty good attorneys with some pretty good cases. And I thought I was such a hotshot young attorney at that time, but I saw situation after situation in which I didn't know how it would go about cross-examining the plaintiff or a witness. And Bill Putman would stand without a note and take them apart. I just was more in awe of him. But in any event, he came in to represent Vicky Rock. And during the course of his preparation, he had Vicky hypnotized because there were certain parts of the story she professed not to be able to remember. She remembered having the gun in her hand, but she didn't remember pulling the trigger and actually shooting her Frank. And so Putman had her hypnotized, where she began to fill in these blanks. And I think that ultimately she told her hypnotist that she recalled that she didn't even have her finger on the trigger, that Frank grabbed the gun and it went off accidentally. Well, we got ready to we were getting ready for a trial, but we objected to the use of that hypnotically enhanced testimony. And we had big hearings on that, and ultimately we prevailed. Judge Enfield sided with the prosecution. Our position was not that all hypnotically enhanced testimony is bad or inadmissible, but in this particular case, they hadn't followed certain safeguards that are recommended and by the experts, mainly an expert named Hurd. And Enfield sided with us, and so he blocked the use of her hypnotically enhanced testimony, and the jury found her guilty, gave her 10 years. And they filed notice of appeal. Supreme Court upheld it. But they went after the issue of hypnotically enhanced testimony. The Attorney General who handled our appeal to Arkansas Supreme Court took a position different from ours. We only went after this particular case, not all hypnotically enhanced testimony. Steve Clark, the Attorney General, argued that all hypnotically enhanced testimony should be excluded because of lack of reliability. And the Supreme Court agreed. And they agreed, they adopted a rule, per se, excluding all hypnotically enhanced testimony. That, in turn, was appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. Putman was gone by this time. Putman had died. And the appeal was handled by Gene Kelly, very a good attorney, really good attorney, out of Rogers, and his partner, Mike Luffman. And so the question before the U.S. Supreme Court really wasn't the question Judge Enfield had ruled on. And that is, in this case, was it done right? They took it up on, was the Supreme Court right that all hypnotically enhanced testimony is bad? And so the Supreme Court reversed and sent it back and said no, that per se exclusion of all hypnotically enhanced testimony is incorrect. And so, in other words, it's case by case, which is what we argued in the first place. But in any event, we got the case back and we got ready for retrial, but this time we pled it out to something less than 10 years, maybe even probation. His parents loved her, and they were all for mercy because they understood the problems. But anyway, how long have I talked?
Long time. Move on to your next.
Okay, another case that stands out was the Frankie Parker case. Frankie Parker was a fella, a jovial, friendly, good talking, good persuasive talker, a young man in Rogers, but he had a bad streak, and he was married to his wife was named Pam, and I'm afraid they were all into drugs, And Pam and her sister were into those drugs. They were raised in a strictly religious environment. And eventually they woke up. And she decided to get off drugs and get away from Frankie. And Frankie couldn't tolerate that. And so at some point in time, he continued to he stalked her, slashed her parents' tires, just harassed the whole family. And but slyly, we couldn't catch him. Then she actually was living with one of her uncles, trying to stay away from Frankie. And Frankie one night set up an alibi in a bar, and then left and dressed in camouflage and rode his motorcycle over to the Warren home and lay in wait until Mr. and Miss Warren came home with their other daughter, Cindy. And Frankie ran out firing, and Cindy got away. He shot at her, and but she still was able to get away. He chased the Warrens into their home, shooting them, and shot them both to death. They died on the floor in their house. He wasn't over. He then left there and went to her, his wife's uncle's house, and went in and kidnapped her. And he left there, had Pam in tow, and decided, probably, we think, reading his mind, that the police had probably picked up Cindy, who ran off, and probably had her at the police department. We think that because he took Pam to the police department, broke in, very lax security in those days. There was an officer named Ray Fine on duty, and he shot Ray. The gunfight ensued, but Ray got hit. And then Frankie retreated to the back part of the jail and held her hostage. Terry Woodside, a good Rogers cop, went in and rescued Ray and got him out of there. And he lived. He's fine. Frankie got on the air. He was talking to the local radio stations and telling them all about what he'd done and what he had to, why, justifying it. And eventually, Keith Ferguson, our state trooper, soon to be, or not soon to be, but later our sheriff, tried to shoot him, shot him with a shotgun, and instead of killing him, just shot a couple of fingers off. Whereupon Frankie shot Pam, dead center. And they burst in and they got Frankie. Pam was bad wounded, but she lived. And so we charged Frankie with 2 counts of murder, several counts of attempted murder, you name it, burglary, because he went into their house to kill them. And we went to the jury eventually, and the jury, I think that on that first trial, I believe it was W.H. Taylor and Jim Lingle. And if I hadn't said it before, W.H. Taylor was also one of the premier defense counsels in this area, still is. He's a super lawyer. And I think, as a matter of fact, I think that he's probably handed me one of my only 2 defeats. The other one was handed to me by John Everett. And so, anyway, the jury convicted Frankie on everything, and they gave him the death penalty. And we got reversed by the Supreme Court of Arkansas. And they bought into the theory, which I still have difficulty understanding, that since the object of the burglary was to kill those folks, it couldn't be considered capital murder. And now, you understand, if the object was to go in and rape Miss Warren, and in the process he killed her, that's capital murder. If he went in the house to steal a TV, and in the process killed the Warrens, it would be capital murder. But the Supreme Court didn't buy it. They bought W.H.'s theory that since murder was the objective of going in, it couldn't be the aggravating circumstance that led it to be capital murder. So they reversed the murder conviction, but they upheld all the other convictions. He still was facing several life sentences. But we decided to go back and try him on the murder. And they called my error procedural, not substantive, and so they let me retry it, and I charged a single count of murder. In the course of committing murder, you kill two or more people. That's another theory of capital murder. We went back and tried him again, and this time he was given the death penalty again. We were successful, and ultimately he was executed.
A lot of the attorneys we've talked to mentioned that you were always known for your preparation, and you said earlier that maybe you got some of that from Putnam, but tell me more about your ability and your desire to always prepare.
I saw my first boss, Gary Kennan, sort of stumble on 2 or 3 cases that I really thought maybe he shouldn't have stumbled on. And I swore that if I became prosecutor, they weren't going to catch me with my pants down. And that was my goal. And I think I practiced what I preached, and I made sure my deputies felt the same way. I try to avoid any surprise that I think's out there. Try to avoid being taken off guard. Try to be thorough in my witnessing. I generally went to murder scenes the night of the murder, or the day of the murder. I tried to see what it was all about there. And I seemed to assimilate that into my approach to the case. But I didn't like to leave any stone unturned. And that's just, I tried to be thorough. And it generally came out pretty good. By working hard and just not quitting. I guess I almost lived the job because I didn't want to be caught unprepared. I was finishing my 8th term as prosecutor. That's a pretty good haul to be prosecutor that long, and they were only 2-year terms. So every 2 years I was running for, every other year I was running for office. And a circuit judge here in Benton County by the name of Sid McCullum determined that he was not going to seek re-election. And so my wife, who at that time was Holly, and I talked it over, and we said, well, you're tired of being prosecutor, maybe this is the time to go for this vacancy. And so that's what we did. We just added one little wrinkle to it. We decided this was the time to make the switch to the Republican Party. And even though I was still in office, having been elected a Democrat, I ran as a Republican. And that caused some hard feelings here and there, but also, I guess in the long run, didn't hurt me that bad because I had a good opponent. His name was Danny Ford, which the Razorback football coach at that time was Danny Ford. So that didn't help, but he fought a hard, honorable race. It was a long, hard race, and it was a close one as far as the final count. But when the dust settled, I'd won, and that's how I became a circuit judge. And I might add, a short 5 years later, Governor Huckabee saw fit to appoint Zolly as a circuit judge. And so I think we were probably the first husband and wife team as circuit judges in the history of the state of Arkansas. And it was nice because she was appointed in 2000, and I retired finally in July of 2011. So I had 11 years we got to be judges here in Benton County. So that's what happened.
Well, you talked earlier about a lot of the cases that you prosecuted. What about some of the ones that you heard? What was it like being on the other side? So what are some of the cases you remember?
It didn't seem like we had as many cases as I had as prosecutor, but we did. The prosecutor had tried a Hispanic individual that had killed a young black man in cold blood. and it was cold blood, and that was tried in my court, and the jury brought in the death penalty. It got reversed. They're saying I made a couple of errors, and I probably did, but it got reversed. So I'm getting ready we're going to retry this, and the prosecutor decided to plead it to life without, and so that's what happened to that. I had some murder cases. I see Mr. Ballman, he and Miss Cushman had murdered, I guess, it was one or two brutally. They were hired to do it for $40,000. And so the lady fled out, took a deal, and she testified against Mr. Cushman, and I think against Mr. Ballman, who I think was represented in my court by W.H. Taylor. But this time the W.H. Was up against the stacked deck, and they convicted, and it was they gave him life without parole, and it was upheld on appeal. I had some other homicides that right now I don't think of them as particularly spectacular. But one of the cases that I had was kind of reminded me of some of my days as prosecutor. One thing I didn't mention, I won't go into, but as prosecutor, you also had the unpleasant duty to, you might say, police our public officials, and I did. And during the course of my years as prosecutor, I prosecuted the sheriff of Benton County, a highly popular Republican. I prosecuted the circuit clerk of Benton County, a highly popular Democrat. I prosecuted the sheriff of Carroll County, highly popular Democrat. The county clerk of Carroll County. And of course, if they wouldn't be in office if they weren't somewhat popular. So that always created some hard problems, no matter whether I won or lost. I finally had, as prosecutor, had brought charges against a very popular mayor here in Bentonville, Mayor O'Neill. And that jury went to trial, and that jury hung. And we were getting ready for a retrial, and the prosecutor, the defense attorney, and I agreed to drop it to a misdemeanor. He'd plead to that, and he would resign. And so that left a lot of people in Bentonville with a bad taste. As a judge, the prosecutor brought charges against a municipal judge by the name of Rodney Owens for charges of evading some taxes on a mobile home that he bought, or RV. And that was a pretty high-profile case. There's one other homicide case I need to mention as a prosecutor, because it still haunts me. A man by the name of Don Davis, a drifter, came into Rogers and ultimately broke into a house in the middle of the afternoon in a nice, peaceful neighborhood in Rogers, and committed a burglary. During the course of that burglary, he stole a .44 caliber pistol. About that time, a lady that lived next door, across the street, came home, and he saw her, and she went into her home, and he went across the street with that .44 caliber pistol. Her name was Jane Daniel, and her husband was very prominent Rogers, a businessman by the name of Richard Daniel, former president of Daisy. At that present time, he's the president of Foam Molding, highly popular. And so he got the drop on Jane, and Jane was sort of paranoid for a case that I had prosecuted years earlier, where her house had been burglarized by a gang. And so as a result, she's a little paranoid, and she'd hid her jewelry and things all over the house. But he put the gun on her, and she took him through the house and gathered all her jewelry for him. And then he took her downstairs, and in point blank, with her looking away, shot her in the back of the head and blew half her head off. It was a gruesome case. It was a gruesome murder. It was a spectacular work by Mike Jones and some of the Rogers investigators. Steve Russell was one of those investigators, and he was brought to justice, and we had a trial, and he was convicted, and the jury gave him the death penalty. But he appealed, which is normal in an adult death penalty case. He lost. And he appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and he lost. And yet, he began to attach his name to every one of these lawsuits in which the people on death row are attacking the chemicals being used to bring about their death. And as a result, he's still alive. And he's been on death row for about 30 years. And that bothers me. I might say that the chemicals that are now being used have been approved by federal court. All it waits is for the governor of the state of Arkansas to set a date, execution date, and for reasons unknown to me, the governor has not chosen to do so. But that's one that still hangs over my head and leaves me with heavy heart. Richard has died. One of their sons has died. I mean, it's been so long that very few people will remember the murder case if he should ever be put to death. One homicide case that I found, I think, pretty significant was a case right here in Bentonville, in which a gentleman by the name of Gary Ward, who was married to a nice young lady by the name of Peggy Ward. They had 2 children. Her parents owned the local lumber company here, and Gary he was well liked in the community, but he had a rough streak, and he was hard to her, hard on her. And in fact, she threatened divorce several times, and in fact, they had even filed for divorce. But in any event, the time came to pass that they were living separate and apart. She lived in Centerton with their 2 children, who had gone over to their mom. And Gary then bided his time, and after the kids had gone to school one morning, went to her residence and shot her to death inside. He then drove to Bentonville. In fact, was coming right down that street out there when the Rogers or Bentonville police officer spotted him. They knew about the murder, and so they were then looking for him. And they caught him, got behind him, and he drove on down here to the jail and turned himself in. Our theory was that he was going to the lumber company to kill her parents. That's our theory. In any event, I charged him with capital murder. One of the sad things about it is, even though it was premeditated and cold-blooded, there were no aggravating circumstances as defined under the law. And without at least one aggravating circumstance, you can't seek the death penalty. Otherwise, I would have. And so he lawyered up, and he got W.H. Taylor as his lawyer. And W.H. got help from an attorney named Steve Val. Steve Val is from Berryville, really Green Forest, but practiced in Berryville. He was he helped me when I ran for prosecutor. He later became one of my deputy prosecutors, best one I ever had in Carroll County until one named Kenny Elser. And so he'd gone into private practice, and the 2 of them were going to represent Gary. They pled insanity, and he was shipped off for examination by the psychiatrist at the state hospital. Now, rarely do they find somebody mentally unfit to proceed. If they do, you probably knew it in advance. In other words, the prosecutor probably knew this will never go to trial. That person is mentally unstable. Gary Ward didn't seem to fit that bill, but after they got through evaluating him, they said in essence he suffered from temporary insanity, an irresistible impulse, and therefore could not form the requisite mental state to suffer criminal responsibility. And we were flabbergasted by that. And so we challenged it. The prosecutor challenged the state psychiatrist. And we had a hearing. And so I went after the state psychiatrist, who had never been, I'd say, against me before. WH was there, and the psychiatrist had built so much of his opinion on things as represented to him by Gary Ward. And so I began sort of to dismantle Gary's story through the facts of the case, including the fact that he had laid in wait. He sat on Main Street in Centerton in a car outside of business. He was spotted by people that knew him, waiting until he saw his kids go by in their truck. Then he went and committed the murder. And it was things like that that eventually caused the psychiatrist to say, if those things are true, then our opinion is wrong. And that meant it's going to be tried by a jury. A jury would make the ultimate call. We had our own psychologist named Dr. Tuft, great guy, who was there on our behalf to testify all the things that Gary did. He clearly he clearly was not insane. He clearly was thinking clearly and had the requisite mental intent to be held accountable. And so with that, WH decided to plead him. And so we pled him to life. I couldn't go for the death penalty, so I dropped it from life without to life. The other case that was, I thought, that one of our biggest challenges was the Sunshine School case. And in that case, the charges were that an assistant, a teacher assistant, who was out there not as a teacher but to help, named Rick Logan, that he was abusing sexually and physically the children, some of the children in school. The children were handicapped physically and some mentally, and some both. And so, in varying degrees of severity. Oh, so that one was a new one, and we hadn't handled that kind of case before. We got into it. There was an investigator on the case from the sheriff's office named Mike Sidoriak, who was quite competent, but was also up against the wall. And once again, Zolly and I, we had just gotten through prosecuting our sheriff of Benton County. It was a jury trial. And so then we were able to focus our attention on the Sunshine School. And we got involved, and the administration from the Sunshine School and the teachers were very, very helpful. They were very concerned, very upset, and they helped us work with the children and learned how to communicate with them for those that really had difficulty communicating, and helped us understand them. And so we were a little bit off balance, but we still, I guess you'd say, we soldiered through, and we finally had narrowed it down to 9 little boys of varying ages that we thought we might be able to make these cases in court beyond a reasonable doubt. And some of the boys were much more, the cases were much stronger than some of the last. Rick hired Marianne Gunn and Leslie Borgononi of Fayetteville to represent him. They moved to separate the charges. We charged them all together. Well, actually, we didn't object because we didn't really know what we were doing. And so we thought, well, okay, we'll have a trial and we'll learn what we're supposed to be doing. And so the judge agreed, and he severed the 9 counts. So we went to trial. And the first trial was Jimmy, wasn't it? Jimmy. And it went beautifully. It went better than we'd ever dreamed it would go. We were euphoric. And the night after our first day of trial, we were so overconfident that, and we're never like that, but this had gone great. Our little victim had testified beautifully. The backup material, the physical. And it was submitted to the jury, and the jury was out for a long time. And then we began to worry. We thought, who's on that jury that we've lost? And eventually the jury foreman came in and reported to the Judge Enfield, that they were hopelessly deadlocked at 8-4. And Enfield told him to go back and give it some more work. And Dolly and I are saying, who on earth, what for could that be that didn't get the picture? Couldn't understand that. They came back after another, I think, couple hours, and they were 9-3. And we said, okay. Our slam shut case didn't persuade 3 people. So judge declared a mistrial. The next day, one of the jurors, a lady, came to our office and informed us it was 9-3 for acquittal. It was 8-4 for acquittal, and after another couple hours, it was 9-3 for acquittal. And one thing that was kind of ironic, there was a big swarthy individual that was on the jury, and his name was Mr. Miranda. And you've heard of Miranda warnings. I made a sorry attempt at, making a joke out of his name, and it did not please him, you could tell. But I left him on the jury because his answers were otherwise good. Well, this lady says, as soon as they got into the jury room, there were 2 men who started saying, you cannot trust these handicapped children. They'll tell, they don't know the truth. They'll tell you can't believe them. They really had an axe to grind that they'd hidden on during jury selection. And so eventually it was 9-3, and the 3 was Mr. Miranda and 2 ladies. And she said that the argument of these people that wanted an acquittal was they've got 8 more charges, which they weren't supposed to know or wasn't supposed to influence them. But they said they've got 8 more charges to try. And she said, Mr. Miranda said, they're going to have 9 more charges to try. And he held them tight. She said, Mr. Miranda held us together. So it was back to the drawing boards. Judge Enfield, I said, he ran these things through. And he was going to reset the jury trial after that term of court so there'd be a completely new jury. We were able to convince Enfield he did not have to do it legally, that if he gave us an opportunity to qualify jurors who hadn't been brought in on the first one, maybe we could find a jury. And so we did. He did just that, and that's when the 2 the 2 ladies were off the case, and John Everett came in. And John Everett tried that Jimmy again. And that's when Jimmy, let's say that John learned a lesson in that case, and he is absolutely one of the best trial attorneys I know, but he had his hands full with our little victim. And the jury on that occasion did convict, and I think they recommended 40 years on that. And so now we felt kind of good, and we were ready to go trial on the next one. And so we asked Enfield to set it quickly. He did. And by the 3rd trial, the girls were back on the case, and John was off the case. And the second little boy, I think the jury gave him life. The 3rd little boy, another 40 years. And so after 3 of them, finally, the girls are saying, we want to consolidate the other 6 charges. We want to put them back together. Well, we were in agreement at that time. And so then we tried with 6 victims, and the it was a miracle. The little boys, including those that were really had difficulty communicating, were just excellent. And one little boy just couldn't communicate verbally at all. And but the jury bought in 6 convictions, and they gave them all 40 years on every one of them. And they went up on appeal. John's case eventually got reversed, but by then all the other cases had been affirmed, with the exception of one, and they reduced that to a misdemeanor on the little boy that couldn't talk. So he got a year on that. Enfield stacked him. He had a life sentence. we opted not to retry Jimmy. But those are the 2 I think that needed to be talked about. Well, let's put it this way. When I was a little boy growing up in Rogers, we rode our bicycles all over Rogers. We walked the streets of Rogers. My cousin and I had a first cousin born about the same time I was. We walked the streets of Rogers unaccompanied by anybody, looking for cigar butts and old cigar butts in the gutters, that we'd walk around with acting like we were smoking. It was safe. Streets weren't paved. The downtown area, the immediate downtown area was paved. My grandma and grandpa's house, which was on 5th Street, was not paved. In fact, I remember when the iceman brought ice for their wooden ice box. I remember when the milk was delivered. Those things are long gone. I remember 102 was a dirt road. I remember when the Bentonville Square was dead all weekend. There was nobody there. I remember one time coming back from Camp Robinson. I was a little boy driving into Rogers, and I saw the population sign, 5,400, and now 67,000. Instead of a bunch of separate cities and mostly country, it's one giant metropolitan area. There's hardly any distinction. We came in on a flight from, we'd actually been to Belize to see some property her brother owns, and we flew in at night, and you couldn't really tell where Bentonville ended, Rogers ended, or Bentonville began, or Bentonville ended and Centerton began. It's Springdale. It has grown so much into a huge metropolitan area that, and I miss that. I miss the quieter, more country Benton County that I grew up in, and the Benton County we had when I first ran for prosecuting attorney in 1978. The population changes have been, I think, the biggest thing. Of course, there was no Beaver Lake when I was a little boy. You brought Beaver Lake in, you brought Walmart in, you brought J.B. Hunt in, Daisy, and the place began to explode in an industrial way. And the place used to be covered with orchards. I told you about my Klinger Orchards nursery, with planting orchards everywhere. Orchards are gone. Even the little 20 acres we lived on in Rogers out in the country, we had a little orchard. Peaches and pears and apples, cherries, gone. So I think that's the acidification, I guess you could say, of Benton County, from mainly rural to less and less rural, is, I think, the big change.
Now, somebody said, hey, tell me about Benton County. Why should I come there? Why is it a good place? What would you tell them?
Well, I tell them it's still one of the cleanest, best places to live. Our crime rate is low. We're not big polluters here. I would warn them that it's growing by leaps and bounds. And for instance, as this recession looms, and I read today, some people agree we're in the recession. The Biden administration will not concede we're in a recession, But I don't think the recession's going to hit Benton County probably until later on, because the influx of people is coming into this county, I think around 1,000 a month. It isn't going to take long for it to change even more into a metropolitan area. And they need houses. And so the housing market is booming, even though right now with the higher interest rate and those prices, the inflation, there's a slowdown coming. I think we'll feel it last here as opposed to other parts of the country, other parts of the state. It's still a good place. It's still a clean place. We still have a beautiful lake, and we've got more and more things now. The museum and art centers, and things of that nature that back to having indoor movies as we once did have. And so I'd say that the unemployment rate is generally quite low here. So if you're looking for work, you're generally going to find work. Those are good things. The potential for getting too big for its britches is there, and I really hope that there's a slowdown eventually in that direction.
One last question here. How would you finish this sentence? My favorite thing about Benton County is...
Well, there are so many things about Benton County. We live out in the country. I love that. We live on a creek. I love that. I love it that it's hard to go to just one single facet. I think there's several facets about the place that make it good. I would say the low crime rate right now, in light of the developments all over the United States, is one of the most attractive. Speaking as a former prosecutor and a former judge.